Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be the second video on my 2JZ C5 Corvette build. Today we're going to walk through all the things it takes to physically fit this engine drivetrain into this car, and I'm going to take you through in the order in which I sort of experienced the complications, if that makes sense. I'm curious to see what people think as we go through this about the decisions I made, whether people think it was smart, dumb, there was a cheap way, I cut some corner. I just want to hear about it. And I'm also curious to see who at the end of this is even going to be remotely interested in doing something like this. Because it is not all easy and it did not all go according to plan.
Hey guys, a quick note before we start doing this walk around. I realize I may not have made it very clear what the goal for this car is, and that is a true, real deal street car. A fire it up, give the keys to my buddy who knows how to drive a stick, and not even worry, just knowing that they'll be fine in my car. Like, they don't even need to know what all modifications have been done. That's the goal for this car. And I think that's important to know before we do the walk around, because it might help to inform some of the decisions I made along the way, before you see something ridiculous and go, well, why'd you go through all that effort? That's why.
All right, so starting up here at the front with the engine, first there are a couple things that are basically non-negotiables about getting that engine into a configuration that will fit in this car. The big thing is all of these engines that people get in the US, like the vast majority are from IS300s. The IS300 is a front sump, right? And this is why it won't fit. What you're looking at right here, dead center, is the rear sump 2JZ pan, and the subframe is this aluminum structure in front of it. The C5 Corvette has this really crazy looking bat wing pan that sits behind this subframe bar, and so it is just not worth whatever hassle it would take to try and get the front sump, which is about the same size as this pan, but basically up here where the pan is just low profile. So that is pretty much a non-negotiable, must happen. All right, so just about a foot back from the oil pan discussion brings us to the bell housing. Now, there are only so many bell housings that Toyota made to fit this engine. I went with an A340, see if you can see it there, J1 bell housing. And there's a couple reasons for this. So the primary reason is because this exact bell housing that you're looking at cost me $90 on eBay. So I figured even if it was wrong, I could live with the price. Second, this is the shortest bell housing that I could find. This is only about 5 inches in total depth, which is good because there's an adapter that is going to need to be put on it. All right, I'm tired of talking about stuff you can't see. Cut to me inside. It's cold out here. All right, so let's talk about the part that I did not do that was critical to this whole project even being possible. And that is the bell housing to torque tube adapter. The adapter that I had made from a local machinist, he did a great job. It is a 1-inch thick aluminum adapter spacer, I think that's what we'll go with, that is threaded to accept all of the bolts from both the A340 bell housing and the GM torque tube. So I brought the torque tube and the bell housing to my machinist, and I just gave him the parts because I didn't really know how to come up with any sort of CAD or files for making an adapter. And I just told him, hey, the difference in height between the original bell housing and this one is 1 inch. So I need a 1-inch spacer adapter. And he was able to get that done. And he said it wasn't even too difficult because, well, the torque tube flange is round and it's concentric around the prop shaft. And the A340 bell housing opening is also round and is concentric around where the input shaft would go. So that made it pretty easy to get the location of those two sides fixed to create that adapter. Like I said, that is way beyond my capability or my tooling. So that would have been a deal breaker. But the good news is that it sounds like any machinist that you guys could contact and bring the parts to is able to do this. Rob Dahm is actually the inspiration for how I solved this problem.
I'm not that original. I saw his 13B project years ago where they made an adapter spacer, basically doing the exact same thing this one is. And it seemed like once they got it made right and clearance and everything, it worked great. So I thought, well, hey, surely this will work again for a different engine combination. And yeah, first version is in the car, and I don't see any reason that it needs to be updated. Hidden inside that A340 bell housing and that custom adapter is the clutch and flywheel. Obviously, there is a mismatch between what the standard clutch on a 2JZ would be and the input shaft or prop shaft in this case in the torque tube. So some sort of conversion is necessary. I originally didn't know how I was going to solve this, and I was just looking around, and eventually it occurs to me, well, lots of people doing drag racing end up running like, T56 or similar transmissions that are built behind all sorts of engines. So surely there's an adapter clutch out there. And yeah, there is. So I ended up going with the McLeod RXT twin disc, which is overkill for what I needed, but it kind of solved everything all at once. It comes with the flywheel, which I didn't have because it was an automatic car before. And came with that clutch, which has the 26 spline pattern on the actual clutch element that works with the torque tube. All right, so the final piece of the puzzle to get that power out of the engine and into the torque tube is the throwout bearing. And I just took a chance and said, I wonder if the stock C5 model will work. I bought a brand new one because the one I had was sort of sticking to the floor a little bit on high RPM shifts before this whole swap started. So I bought a new one, I put it in, and yeah, it works great. I would love to tell you that I did some crazy measurement and verified and all that. I didn't. I just bought it because it was cheap, compared to like a tick or something else, that's 4 times the price. I figured I would just see if OEM works because I kept all the other spacing the same, right? And yeah, it was fine.
All right, so now that we've talked about how we are going to attach the engine to the torque tube and to the rest of the driveline, one of the biggest decisions was where this engine was actually going to land in the bay, both up and down and forward and back. Obviously, on center is the only real option for side to side. So that determines a lot of things moving forward. So you need to be able to run wipers since this is a street car, and while there is a hole there, they work. I don't want the bottom of the engine touching on the subframe, and we have to get the steering rack back up here somewhere. So every time you move this further forward, the worse that situation gets. Another key thing is once you have the engine bolted up to the driveline and you're trying to decide how forward and back to position it, one of your big limiters is going to be these CV axles. They can only move so far, so you need to be careful with moving forward or back because there's only a set amount of travel, and I wanted to use stock axles. All right, so how far from the stock location did I actually end up positioning it? This is the best way I can show you. This is the rear subframe out of the car, and I have this steel plate with bolts where the differential mounts used to go, and then a notch that I have cut. And I'm not sure exactly where it lands in this, but you can see, oh, there we go. It's right at 3 inches, maybe a tiny bit less, maybe a tiny bit more, just depends. But about 3 inches rearward travel was required to fit the 2J. And I will show you how close it came to not fitting even with that adjustment. All right, so here we are looking at what you can see right there, that bolt and wheel is the crank pulley. And that bar right here is the steering rack. And they are incredibly close together. It is hard to even get a view of the bolt head from here. It is about 3/8 of an inch. That is how close this came to not fitting. And you can see that even required some modification to do. You can see the entire steering rack is in front of its subframe mount. I'll take you back to the top to show you what I'm talking about. All right, so what am I talking about with the steering modifications? Those two ears right there make up one side of the steering rack mount for the stock location. You can see that there's a spacer that I put in between, and it has a through bolt with the rack actually existing towards the front. This view is looking towards the front of the car. So the rack is moved forward its own width plus the width of that ear in order to buy more space in the engine bay for the engine, because it is just so much longer than the original LS. This rod running through right here is the steering shaft. And you can see it has a bump right there, center screen. That's because when the rack got moved forward, a consequence, like everything else, it just snowballs. This now has to be longer. So the rack was cut, had a sleeve put on, and welded back up without changing the orientation. And it works great. The steering feels just like it used to. That torque tube positioning also affects the height of the engine above the subframe. See if I can get you focus. Focus. All right, so what you're looking at here is the closest point between the subframe and the oil pan. Really no more than 1/4 of an inch of clearance right there. If you need to service this, the subframe has to come out. There isn't loads of room up top either. Looking at the stock valve covers, which I have elected to retain for a couple reasons that I'll talk about later, you do end up having to cut clearance into this windshield wiper valance cover, I don't know what the term is, but it's just a composite sheet, very easy to cut through. I originally didn't want to, but this was ultimately necessary to make enough space for the engine to fit. But the good news is that you can see I still have my seal for the hood. The hood does close, and with the cover on this section, you really can't tell anything is cut. All right, so coming to the back of the car, we can talk about one of the last things that was impacted by the positioning chosen for the motor and the driveline. So the transmission here is in the dark. One second. Now that there's some light, you can see the transmission being held up by the jack right here. This does hang down quite a bit lower than the torque tube, and by pushing the transmission rearward, it actually interferes with a cross member on the rear subframe. So we'll walk over to that. So coming over here, you can see evidence of there used to be a support running across here to here. That just wasn't gonna work, and it was pretty close. So what I elected to do, since my car is not using the stock springs anymore, is I just took a thick wall piece of square tube and I just cut it to where I had some mounting flanges, and let's see if I can flip this. Oh man. There we go, had to use both hands to flip it up. I elected to just bolt a tube across the rear subframe that just bought me some depth basically. So this is just a little bit lower and gives me just enough room to clear. I don't know if this was ultimately necessary, but this was a peace of mind decision. All right, so you've decided where the engine wants to go, and now it comes time to lock it in place. How are you gonna do that? Well, there are no commercially available options, or really even helpful universal options to bolt this into place. So go with what you know. I ended up using some stock isolators that are in the stock location. They bolt straight through down to the subframe, and they have a stud that comes straight up. So I then used some 1/4 inch thick steel plate and some thick wall square tubing, another plate on the engine side. And I don't have proper metalworking tools, so I used an angle grinder with a cut and a grind disc and just worked it until I got to a shape that works. It's not good, I wouldn't sell it or anything like that, but so far it doesn't seem like it's had any issues supporting the power of the weight. All right, so next let's talk about this box right here. If you're not a Corvette guy, you may not know what this is, but that's okay. They call it an electronic braking control module, or EBCM. And as you might be able to guess, this is not where it normally lives in the car. Depending on your model year, it'll either be approximately right here, but shift maybe about right here. and is turned so the tubes are facing the driver's side and the wire is facing the passenger side. It is bolted straight to the front of the subframe. That's not going to work if you have an engine that is longer or have any accessories that need to go in front. So mine had to move. If you have an earlier Corvette, it is actually in the back and sits basically right in front of that hump right there. You can see that cutout. But I'm not that lucky. Mine is a 2000, so not an option. So I didn't want to reinvent everything up here, so this was my solution for how I did this with the least amount of changes. So there's a big bracket that comes up from the front. Not a very good visual, but you get it. I took that, I cut it apart, and I will cut to some photos to make this easier, but you can see there is a little bit of a bracket down there. I just used nut certs and went straight to the top of the frame rail. I just rebent a lot of these lines, and yes, I know it's not pretty, but some of them did have to get remade. The two for the front wheels are both aftermarket lines that I just made myself, and this wiring harness had to be extended. There's just no way that it was gonna fit, so I extended it about, I don't know, 2 feet, probably longer than I needed to, but I wasn't super confident when I made this decision. But yeah, that took several hours of my life. All right, so now that I've done a walk around of the car with you guys, showing what it takes, let's talk about all the things that I did that I ended up redoing, totally scrapping, was disappointed with. You've heard a few of them as we went. I didn't want to have to cut holes in the car to fit any of this stuff. I really wanted it to be the least invasive it could be, which I think is a good starting point for any swap because things are not going to go according to plan. So if you aim really high, you can end up with just a few things that you have to compromise on. The biggest one is the steering. Because the steering rack has been moved forward and the Corvette runs a deep dish on its front wheels, I have an issue where the tie rods and the C5 Z06 wheels that I have for the car touch. And they don't touch just a little bit, they touch a lot. So that is something that I'm going to need to figure out. The good news is that spacing the wheels out will help, and replacing the wheels with something larger than a 17-inch wheel will help as well. So I think I can get to a wheel setup that doesn't give up too much width in the front, but does not rub quite so badly, because it's to the point now where if you hit it, it is alarming. It is a horrible noise. It is not, it sounds like the car is exploding. So that is probably the biggest single failure of this project to date. The steering configuration that you saw is the best one I could come up with. I tried for a long time to fit the rack under the engine like it's done in the Mark IV Supra. I think it's done in the Mark IV Supra. Don't quote me on that. But I tried to move it back to where it was underneath the very front of the oil pan to keep it more in line with its original location for the back in the car, but just lower. And I tried to make mounts and bend them, but I don't have proper metalworking tools. At the time when I was trying that, I didn't even own a welder, so the best I was doing was hammering on, 1/4-inch steel plate and hoping for the best. That didn't work out very well, and it ended up having to remove so much material out of that front subframe. I ended up having to get rid of that front subframe. I had weakened it so much that it was no longer fit for service. So that's when I kind of gave up on that idea after blowing up probably a dozen grinder discs and wasting weeks, honestly, trying to make something that worked. I just gave up on that idea and went with what is on the car currently. Another major failure that I set out to have for the car but didn't end up happening, and there were some little hints about it in the video, there is no AC in the car. Now, there is heat, the blower motor is still there, and a lot of the provisions for the AC still fit the car, but the compressor that the 2JZ uses for the IS300, I don't know about any others, but the one that I got with the engine won't fit. The clutch drive that goes on the very front of the compressor means that it sticks just a little bit further forward than all of the accessories and further forward than the crank pulley as well.
So that means it was going to touch the steering rack, even moved as far forward as it is. So like I said, that's gone and there's no concrete plan to put AC back in the car, but I do have an idea on how it could be done. And considering there's already some modifications in the rear of the car, I think I might even know where I'd do it. So if this project gets legs and you guys want to see that, maybe that's a future topic. All right, last but not least is the valve cover situation. Uh, it is just very difficult to get them on and off of the engine. And when you're doing a whole bunch of development work and trying to get the fit just right and not trying to cut the cowl, which I had to do anyway, it just ended up being a gigantic pain. It is actually the way it sits right now. In order to get the passenger side valve cover off, you have to drop this front subframe about half an inch to buy you just enough clearance to slip it over the cam in the back. It's not that big of a deal, but when you're working on it, it is a pain. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this video. I originally wanted to talk about all the plumbing, fuel system, intake, everything hardware-wise on the car, but the video just got too long, so that'll have to wait until the next one. If you've got questions about any of the stuff I've been showing in this video, drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to reply. And if I missed anything big, I can always add it in the next video. So appreciate you watching. Thanks. Bye.